when the parent raises the child the wrong way, the parent pays the price when the child goes down the tubes. But these third parties can sit back in their wherever they are, Washington or whatever, and if the things they tell us turn out to be wrong, it doesn't hurt them.
This is economist Thomas Sowell, whose book I mentioned in my previous video about Candace Owens. Here he's talking about children going down the tubes, which is just such an economist way of describing undesirable behavior among adolescents.
You have no choice but to vote for me because your 401ks down the tubes.
As for third parties not being held accountable, I largely agree with this, but I want to talk about some claims that he's about to make here.
For example, before we introduced sex education into the schools in the 60s, the rate of venereal disease had been going down every single year.
Firstly, as I cover extensively in my previous video, sex education wasn't introduced into schools in the 60s. It was around for decades before that, with federally funded campaigns raising awareness of and specifically combating the spread of venereal disease, which at the time referred to syphilis and gonorrhea. It is because of this sex education that the rate of venereal disease was going down every single year since World War II.
I think it was the rate of infection for gonorrhea in 1960 was half of what it was in 1950. So all these things were going down before the left came into the schools with their sex education. And all these things reversed and shot up immediately afterwards.
Yes, while the rate of infection for gonorrhea was lower in 1960 than it was in 1950, although it wasn't as much as half, it actually began increasing again in 1958, not in the 60s. In fact, one of the reasons why the rate increased in the 60s is because prior to 1964, gonorrhea was actually quite difficult to accurately diagnose. That was until a selective culture medium was developed that made widespread testing possible. This was particularly important when it came to testing women because before this, gonorrhea was thought to be mostly asymptomatic in women. Not to mention that if a woman did test positive for gonorrhea in the 20s, 30s, and even the 40s, this could be treated as evidence of prostitution and she could be arrested, isolated, and quarantined under the Chamberlain-Carn Act. This is why in 1972, when federally assisted state and local programs to control gonorrhea were implemented, efforts focused on screening women through culture analysis and encouraging infected male patients to bring or refer their sexual partners for medical care. If we bring this back to teenagers, because remember this is about sex education in high schools, it is important to note that in the period between 1968 and 1971, various states passed laws permitting physicians to treat teenagers for STIs without notifying their parents. And so it's unsurprising that as a result of these case detection activities, the proportion of reported cases of gonorrhea among adolescent females rose. Indeed, by 1973, in the 15 to 19 year age group, the gonorrhea rates for females surpassed those for males. To say that it was the left coming into schools with their sex education which caused the rise in gonorrhea is not only incorrect, but it's also blatant fear-mongering when you consider that during this time only 6 states and the District of Columbia mandated the teaching of some form of family life or sex education.
Nobody who pushed that paid any price for it.
The rhetoric around sex education and an underlying nefarious agenda is not new. This is an old playbook with chapters dedicated to Cold War propaganda, and understanding where these talking points come from is necessary to cut through the noise surrounding sex ed today.